On this episode of China Unscripted, tensions are heating up between China and the Philippines, while the Chinese economy cools. Civil unrest could be on the horizon, and Xi Jinping is getting desperate. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshda.
And joining us once again is David Day, chairman of the Global Risk Mitigation Foundation. If you watched our last podcast with him 2 weeks ago, you might have noticed we had some technical difficulties and it was cut short. So we couldn't wait to have David on again. And for those of you about to meet David Day for the first time, he's worked in the Philippines for more than 40 years and advises people in the military and government. He also advises companies that are facing the risks of doing business in China. David, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
It's great to be here again and great to see all three of you.
So last time we spoke, we went over a lot of the recent increase in aggression of the Chinese Communist Party against the Philippines in the South China Sea, attacking Filipino boats with axes and knives. Since then, supposedly they've signed some kind of agreement. The details are still pretty sparse, but that they say will de-escalate the tensions. What do you know about this agreement? The CCP is known for honoring its agreements. So what's going to come of this?
Well, okay. So without making a long diatribe of this, the short answer is that it looks like there's a provisional agreement that was made. There's a disagreement amongst the two sides as to the details of that agreement. And the Philippines is working responsibly to try to de-escalate this whole conflict. But I think it's important to appreciate the larger issues that are here that kind of frame these negotiations. In the past, what's happened is that the Chinese negotiators have come to the Department of Foreign Affairs in Manila, and they basically read out their talking points and either get up and leave, or they sit there stone-faced, and there's no real exchange back and forth. And this time it was real different. And the context of this, the larger picture, is that number one, as painful as this is, we have to understand that essentially the U.S. has lost its ability to provide deterrency or act as a deterrent force in the Indo-Pacific region. And we see this with moves around the Senkakus and the Taiwan situation, as well as in the South China Sea. So, the Philippines understands this. The second thing is that while we typically look at the South China Sea issue as China defending its sovereignty and moving aggressively, that kind of looks like beginnings of some type of military push against the Philippines. I think it's important to remember that a lot of what China is doing, they are playing to the home audience. It's a domestic play. And so that comes back, Chris, to your question here is, what's really going on? And the deputy or the assistant national security advisor, Malaya, has just had a press conference yesterday in which he was explaining they know that the Chinese are spinning this agreement, playing to the home audience. Those are not the terms that the Philippines agreed to. And what the Chinese are saying is, here's the deal. The Philippines has agreed that they would tow this ship and not leave any personnel or facilities behind when they're through. We will permit, upon advice, advance warning, humanitarian resupply. And they have agreed, this is the Chinese version, that there will be no construction materials.
And this is the Sierra Madre, the ship the Filipinos ran aground.
Correct. And so the Philippines is saying, we didn't agree to that. That isn't the deal. But there is some kind of agreement that's being kept quiet to see if they can make it work. And I think that there's some other factors that are playing into this, Chris. This transparency initiative has really caused enormous bleeding on the part of China, and they're trying to stop this bleeding by getting something in place because the media has just been beating up the PRC something terrible. And there's also, I think, some concern on the Chinese part. If they do another aggressive move, they might just be humiliated like they were up in the Himalayas with the uh, what is it, the Galwan Valley exercise, because they have been given a warning by General Bronner that if you folks do this again, we're going to meet your aggression uh, with our own. And I think that the China just does not want to take any more humiliation from the Philippines. So that's their motivation to get in and cut a deal.
You said that the deal that the Chinese side was trying to frame the deal in a way that the Philippines is like, "Wait a minute, that's not what we said." Is this an attempt to make like kind of try to embarrass the Philippines into agreeing that okay, if they come out first and say the deal was things like no construction materials, and then the Philippines does that they can kind of make that seem like the Philippines did something wrong, violated the deal, etc.
Shelley, you are right on the money there. Um, they're playing to the home audience, but also this is exactly like that so-called gentleman's agreement arrangement that we saw previously. That China comes out with their version of it, and this, Shelley, what you've hit on is a concept called cognitive anchoring. That is the first one that gets the story out, anchors the concept or in people's minds, and it's very difficult to move that once they come out first. And so yes, this is an opportunity for China. This is what they're doing: is they're coming out first and saying these are the points of the deal. And in the future, should the Philippines come out and say publicly, now, wait a second, we didn't agree to that, then that puts China in the position so they can call the Philippines uh, or label them as reneging on the deal. So you're absolutely right.
So how do you prevent that, or like is there anything the Philippines can do about that now that China has done this?
Well, here's the challenge. Um, the Philippine negotiating team agreed that they would keep the details out of the public. And you all know from your experience that China is not real good about keeping the heart of the deal or the substance of the deal. So the Philippines is going to stick by their bargain at least for a while. And I think there are sufficient statements being made by the national uh, assistant national security advisor and the National Security Council and others that, come on, that we would not agree to these types of provisions. And I think that that's going to have to suffice for now. But it is a negotiating advantage that China has pulled. No question about it.
So what is really in the deal?
Well, Matt, I wasn't in the room, and the actual deal has been kept from the public, is being kept from the public for the time being. Um, I suspect that you know that there's an agreement that they're going to allow resupply without hassle, and that there's some type of understanding that maybe large amounts of construction materials will not be sent out there. I don't know.
You said China was playing for the domestic audience. Do you think they're also playing to the Philippine audience? Because as I understand it, the attack on the Filipino ships was not well received in the Philippines. Does this make people in the Philippines think, "Oh, our government is weak. Our government is caving to the CCP. They're going to remove the Sierra Madre. Is China sending this message to the Filipino people?
Yes, they they are working this political crack that we have discussed previously between the Marcos side of the government and the former President Duterte and his daughter, the Vice President Sarah Duterte's um, opposition to Marcos. And what China is doing is trying to show, hey, we maybe we made a mistake, we went a little overboard, so we're willing to cut a deal. So uh, cut us some slack and come back over to our side.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned this divide between Marcos and former President Duterte because I'm going to get some of the details wrong, I think, but information just came out about the POGOs, the Filipino offshore gambling operations, and some connections between that and Duterte.
Correct.
To an extent, kind of making it seem like maybe Duterte was a little more involved with the CCP than might have been known.
I have heard that. I don't. What I do know on that point, Chris, is that the explosion of these offshore gambling operations in the Philippines occurred under the Duterte administration, under the theory that they would generate revenue for the Philippine government, and that revenue has been very modest. But your question goes to the extent that the former president Rodrigo Duterte was actually involved in these pogos, and I don't have any evidence of that. I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that those um, overseas gambling operations really brought in the dirty underside of China's criminal activities. They brought in not only the gambling, but all kinds of scams, human trafficking, and certainly on the espionage side of things. And in some sense, they are related to the discovery over the last year of at least three weapons caches that I'm aware of around Metro Manila. And these weapons caches involved the capture of not only small arms, but of PLA uniforms, and some of them even had the term reconnaissance team on the badge there. So there is a nasty connection on the espionage as well as on the criminal side. But insofar as Duterte personally being engaged with those, I don't know. Um, I will add one interesting piece. In the mouth of the harbor of Manila Bay, there is an island, and that island is very near the Sangley Point or Cavite naval base. And that island is now called Pogo Island. And it was formerly owned by the Ramilla family, and they sold it to Chinese SOE, which operates this massive Pogo operation there. And um, Marcos has declared in this State of the Nation speech on Monday that these Pogo operations are no longer welcome in the Philippines, and he wants the personnel all out by the end of the year.
So a couple things to clarify about these pogos. So they're bringing in all this crime, right, and the human trafficking and
Right.
other types of. So, but you also said that it was an SOE, so state-owned enterprise from China that owns at least one of these.
Yes.
So this is not like Chinese gangs setting up these things on their own.
No.
Like there's a very clear connection between China and its, with the PLA uniforms. I mean, this is like a very serious infiltration by the Chinese Communist Party into getting its boots on the ground in the Philippines.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct, Matt. And this infiltration into the Philippines in through these pogos and the arms weapons caches, it's let me put it this way: comparing the Philippines and the United States, at least the Philippines is trying to protect their borders. They may be doing a very ineffective job, but this is not related to your show, but we have essentially the same problems starting in the United States here with Chinese nationals, young men of military age, physically fit, crossing our own border. And you can, if you go to downtown Manila and you go to one of the main casinos, you'll notice a number of rather unusually fit individuals who are operating blackjack tables. So, I mean, it is a penetration infiltration problem. You are exactly right.
So it was funny because I saw that actually China had officially at least praised Marcos for cracking down on these pogos. Like what's going on there?
Well, what's going to happen is kind of like the drug trade, the various drug manufacturing operations owned by the PLA in Guangdong province, is that China wants to divorce itself from this ugly, dirty underside of criminal activity, and gambling has been outlawed in the People's Republic of China. And so the last thing China needs, Matt, is more humiliation at the hands of the Philippines. And so they're going to jump on the bandwagon and say, yes, yes, this is bad stuff.
That are state-owned enterprises involved in.
Yes.
Now, so far, the Philippines has not requested U.S. help in dealing with the CCP. Why is that?
Well, okay. Let me back up one quick second. I believe that the United States has offered assistance. The reason I say that is Jake Sullivan made the comment at the recent Aspen event, and General Bronner has said the United States has offered assistance. And I know that the United States has been engaged in some fashion in some type of planning for what do they do with the Sierra Madre, what are they going to do with a Union Shoal, and so forth. But the reason that the Philippines has not taken the United States up on this is, first of all, we don't know how sincere that offer is. And the Philippine leadership, of course, is very concerned about the United States not being able to fulfill its commitments or promises. So they're loath to put the issue on the table squarely and find out that they were wrong and the United States is not going to back them up. But I think, Chris, the short answer to that question really comes down to a matter of pride, in the sense that the Philippines is now in the minds of the leadership becoming, or has become, a middle power. And they want to try to exhaust every possible option on handling this problem themselves without relying on the United States. Because remember, if the United States gets involved, then it adds political fire to some of the opposition forces to Marcos, who say that, now you got the United States involved, now we're a bigger target, and, this is worsening the situation.
I also think, I remember in the last podcast you were saying that there's actually a lot the U.S. could learn from the Philippines in dealing with China. It's not that the Philippines is some damsel in distress that needs the U.S. to come and swoop in and save them from the CCP.
Yes, although I would say that precise description has not been used by Indo-PACOM here in Hawaii, but it is the attitude, I think, that we see many in our military and the State Department, that the Philippines is absolutely got to have the United States there. My perception and understanding, as we discussed in previous shows, is that the Philippine military is very well trained, and they are increasingly well equipped. They're getting more modern equipment, and they are used to being in the fight. And so this is becoming an increasingly difficult problem for China.
So this week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is off to Asia, and that will include a visit to the Philippines. What do you think the significance of this trip is?
Uh, I think it's to do two things. One is to get an understanding of what is the deal you Philippines cut with China anyway. Let us understand what that is. The second thing is, um, I think Blinken is going to do the standard. Uh, you know, we're going to be there shoulder to shoulder. He'll issue, comrades in arms type blood brothers reassurance for the Philippines. I think the problem that Blinken has is that increasingly over time his credibility is becoming watered down.
And so then I guess big picture with this agreement, obviously, whatever was in the agreement, it did not solve the territorial dispute
Oh,
between China and the Philippines.
absolutely not.
Just what do you think is next? And
Well,
is there a way to actually solve it?
I think what's coming next is uh, the question in my mind, Chris, is whether the Philippines in that agreement is sufficiently comfortable, which I doubt they are, that it will stave off the filing of a second arbitration. And I think this is one of the things that China is scared to death over is the Philippines goes back into litigation, whether it's with the International Court with The Hague or in a private litigation maybe in the Philippine courts having to do with environmental degradation, seeking monetary damages. And so I think that the Philippines has got some options, and we shouldn't always focus on the military. And this topic that we've just covered about Marcos banning the pogos in the Philippines, this is what I would call a flexible deterrent option. It's a way of cracking China uh, uh, upside the head for some of its conduct. And this is a big loss of face for China because it exposes the dirty underside of some of their activities in foreign countries. These pogos, this concept of criminal activities, human trafficking, is not just limited to the Philippines.
Could you talk about how the Alice Gould case, which is related to pogos, has now that it's kind of come out that she's probably a Chinese citizen and not the Philippines-born Chinese person that she apparently took the identity of. How is this playing in the Philippines, and how is that related to like what's happening with pogos and like the perception towards China?
Well, this woman, Alice Guo, was the mayor of a relatively small town in the province of Tarlac, which is just north of Metro Manila. And the town is about 75, 80,000 in size. And she became the mayor of this town. And then they discovered that she was a part owner of the land under one of these pogos, which they raided, and they discovered all kinds of cash and uh, challenges with human trafficking, and that she had a number of very expensive automobiles. And so there was an investigation that played out like some kind of televised. It was of enormous interest in the Philippines because the hearings were televised. She was before the Philippine Senate. And then it was discovered that maybe this is not uh, a Philippine born national, entitled to political office. And so there was more research and more investigation. And lo and behold, it looks like she's a Chinese national that had been moved into the Philippines since she was a teenager and now achieved political office and was operating as a front for some of these criminal or espionage activities. And so, Shelley, this Alice Guo incident has really inflamed the Philippines further anti-China, and it is, it's reminiscent of a playbook that we've heard about in the old Soviet Union when young people were moved into various Western countries, including our own country, and then they were raised within that country. They had a local accent, and maybe they ultimately became like an espionage sleeper cell. And this is what the Alice Guo incident really looks like to the Filipino people, that this is a sleeper cell, one of potentially thousands that China has set up in the country. And it has, you know, it's pushed the needle further against China. And that's why public opinion is so strong to support the Philippine government in maintaining its the country's sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea and pushing back against China.
How does that fit into this divide that you were talking about between Marcos and Duterte?
Well, it cuts the other way, Chris. It obviously it's it's advantageous on the Marcos side because they are then able to say, "See, we told you so." These Chinese that are coming into the country are coming in for evil purposes, malign influence, and we need to be very careful of them. And in some cases, they need to be deported.
Now, I wonder. China just held its third plenum, which is supposed to be about the economy. Currently, the Chinese economy is
Oh, are we moving off the Philippines?
well. This ties into it.
Okay.
The Chinese economy is not doing well. How is that affecting their ambitions vis-a-vis the Philippines?
Well, I think, Chris, it ties back into where we started with this show, and that has to do with this negotiation interest that China had to reach some kind of accommodation with the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. And the reason I say that is that this third plenum, unless one of you can see something in that came out of that third plenum that I certainly can't, uh, it doesn't really do anything in terms of improving the economy. And so that what the leadership in Beijing is facing is the potential, and we've discussed this before, the potential for social unrest if they don't get this economy straightened out. And the potential for social unrest is, I think, part of the motivation for China playing to the home audience in spinning the negotiations and the result that they achieve with the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs in terms of this agreement. You follow me on that?
Well, because as you were saying, if they do get into a similar confrontation with the Philippines like they did with India in the Galwan Valley, with the economy being what it is right now, that would be particularly devastating to the
Oh,
party's internal propaganda.
absolutely. And so the leadership has got to be very, very sensitive to anything that makes them look bad. And so look, you've had in your series of podcasts lots and lots of discussions about uh, the Chinese and the Chinese culture. And from my business experience, to me, it all boils down to two things. The Chinese are interested in money. That's their one of their key motivations. And the other is they've got to maintain face. And maintaining face is to avoid humiliation. And this whole exercise that has been going on since Marcos took office between the Philippines and China has been a brilliantly executed exercise, a series of tactics involved in humiliating China. And this is very dangerous for the leadership, and they can't stand this. That's why this is a soft, sensitive spot that the Philippines is going to continue to press on because they understand this.
Well, so it seems like this is a very unique time where not just the Philippines, but the Philippines, the U.S., Japan, India could really apply a lot of pressure to the CCP and get them on the back foot.
Yep, you are absolutely correct. I mean, I've often thought about this as we potentially approach the coming uh, potential for a change of administration in the United States. That there is a setup here for kind of like what we saw with Reagan back during the Cold War era, in terms of a series of soft spots that could be pressed on to modify the CCP's behavior, or depending upon the amount of pressure, take them down. I don't know whether that's even a possibility or not, but I can certainly see the soft pressure points developing, and I'm sure that there are individuals with a lot more expertise than I'll ever have who can predict what might happen, but I certainly see those emerging.
Well, so what advice would you give a future Trump or Harris administration for applying pressure on China's soft spots?
Um, I think that the big issue, Chris, is really the economic war that has been taking place, and the way that we don't know what's going to come out of the third plenum. It may be that when the party leadership goes to their summer retreat, they'll come up with some specific ideas. But right now, we don't see anything other than the words reform and opening up. And on the Western side of things, economists, we look at this and we see we've got these laws of economic gravity that are going to continue to cause problems. But we have to remember that that economy is built by the party, and the party has uh, its own belief as to where it is, where it's going, and they're basically ignoring the advice of the Western economists. So I don't know where that's going to go, but I do see that the economic side of things is where some of China's malign misbehavior might be brought to heel, and so those would include uh, actually enforcing the sanctions regime that were put in place for the Ukraine war against Russia, where China is supplying arms and weapons and material support. So that's on the sanctions side. I think on the tariff side, if the Chinese leadership is scared to death of any additional restriction on imports coming into the United States. So if anything that cuts back on their export ability is going to be tremendously impactful. And I think that the notion of America first, we have to be careful of this, because America first does not mean America alone. And this is an opportunity for the United States to work with its like friends, its allies, its like-minded countries in promoting different kinds of trade agreements that don't include China. And this is where I think the economic squeeze is where uh, we'd get some really significant results.
Yeah, I mean, actually, at the third plenum, Xi Jinping and other leaders, as far as I've read, talked about how to make the Chinese economy more sanctions proof. So they're clearly worried about something.
Well, I mean, that we're really close to, I mean, look, Matt, we're operating with an administration in the home stretch. We're operating with an administration that is very risk adverse. We're operating with an administration that is having enormous difficulty on a foreign policy and a military level handling the current world conflicts in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Red Sea, around the Senkakus, in Taiwan, and the West Philippine Sea, and on and on and on. And I think that we have to bear in mind that type of it's sort of like unwilling to walk and chew gum at the same time. That inability to handle these types of things makes them, um, you know, not really want to do anything, and that just exacerbates the whole problem that we've been talking about throughout the Indo-Pacific region, because that adds to the challenge of lack of deterrence.
Do you think, on the flip side of, we talked about the third plenum, China being weak economically, that being a place for other countries to hit on China's soft spots, in terms of the CCP looking at the US election and things like, Biden stepping down, Harris coming in on the Democratic Party side, the assassination attempt against Trump, like it seems like there's a lot of now, usually in July and August, it's not really ramped up yet, right? And
Correct.
now it seems like this may be a unusual and chaotic election season. Do they look at, times like this in the US and go, well, maybe this is an opportunity for us to, do some things that ordinarily would get us negative attention, but we might get away with it now?
What are America's soft spots?
Well, this, in some ways, Shelley, this ties back to um, Matt's question about sanction proofing the Chinese economy, and and the issue that the leadership in Beijing has got to be thinking about as they look at these soft spots on the U.S. side is: are we sufficiently prepared if we make a move to handle, for instance, our banks being cut out of the SWIFT system? Can we handle the energy chop off if the Malacca Strait is closed? Are we prepared on the military side, having just changed the leadership out another time? So that's what you have on the Chinese side of the ledger. And certainly as they look at the US, um, the implication of your question is is very astute, because you're seeing a time envelope in which many people say that, if Xi Jinping is going to make a move against against Taiwan, uh, boy, this is sure looks like the window of time to do it, because essentially the U.S. Is crippled in its leadership.
So do you think it's likely that the CCP will try to take this time when there's confusion over the U.S. election, and even in some circles, confusion over how active the Biden is in terms of actually himself running the country, take advantage of that over the next 6 months and try to actually launch that invasion of Taiwan?
I would say there's a threat of invasion, Matt, and so the way to look at this is to do kind of a risk analysis. And what you have to do is you have to say, okay, and I'm speaking from the perspective of Xi Jinping now. okay, if I invade Taiwan, basically what I have to do is bet the farm, meaning there is some possibility that these countries, Japan, Philippines, and Taiwan, will put up more resistance than I expect. And there is this possibility that the United States will do what it could do, and that is step in. So, do I want to bet the farm? And as we look at that risk on the Chinese side, I would say that the risk is down below the 50% mark. However, that being said, man, you never want to bet the sovereignty of a country on a 45% or a 35% or a 25% risk. You've got to prepare as if it was an 80% chance that the Chinese were going to come across the Taiwan Strait. And so the important thing to be done between now and change of administration is that all of the levers that we can push in terms of encouraging arms sales to Taiwan, support for Japan, support for the Philippines are critically important. Because even if the risk is below 50%, um, you never want to bet the sovereignty of one of your allies or like-minded countries on a lower risk. Does that make sense to you? Do you follow that?
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the idea that, for Xi Jinping, it's like the idea of betting the farm. One of the things that came out of the third plenum was just repeated talk of Xi Jinping's central role in the CCP, the importance of Xi Jinping thought. Essentially, it seems like he's a little concerned about how much control he has moving forward with the possibility of civil unrest in China. And with the economy what it is, do you think it could get to the point where Xi feels this is all going to collapse? My best bet is to bet the farm and just see how that shakes out.
Chris, that's a possibility. I wouldn't discount that. You're calling that it's a desperation move, maybe that pushes irrationality, and that could happen. I mean, in what we have to remember is in the back of the minds of the senior Chinese leadership is what I call a Ceausescu moment. And they all remember the rapid and violent turn that took place. I think it was in Romania when the people turned against the authoritarian leadership that was very, very favorable towards Mao and China. And within a matter of days, there were these violent executions of Ceausescu and his wife. And I think that that's in the back of the minds. And when you think about China's situation today in the world, if you have a social explosion among the people in the country, where does that leadership flee to? Where do they go? Russia? Maybe, maybe not. Iran? Possibly. I'm not so sure they really want to go to North Korea. So, I mean, the options that the leadership is looking at are not very good. And I think we always have to, as we've talked about before, we have to watch the social side on this economy as to how far it's going, how bad the situation is really getting. Um, and that's going to be increasingly difficult with Xi Jinping taking much tighter control of things.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of taking tighter control because he's talking about reform, but he's not using the definition of reform that we in the West typically associate with Deng Xiaoping's reform or the Gaiga Kaifeng, the reform and opening up of the late 70s and the 80s. Xi Jinping's reform seems to be taking back more of the economy under state control.
That's correct.
Right? But using a term that people in the West think, oh, this is great. So there's kind of maybe a lie baked into that. But is that even like, can that save the Chinese economy? Because, oh, well, real estate prices are out of control. There's this real estate boom and bust. Like maybe more state control will stabilize these problems, right? I mean, that must be what he's thinking. Is that going to work?
Here's the piece, the part about that, Matt, that's really tricky. You and I, Matt, have a Western economic perspective on things. And we believe that there are laws of economics that operate like laws of gravity. And so you have, for instance, Adam Smith's invisible hand concept. And what you are talking about is Xi Jinping is going from an invisible hand to a visible hand type control situation. And from the Chinese perspective, they think they're going to be doing the right thing, that they can right this ship and everything is going to be just fine. I personally agree with you. I don't see it. I don't see how this is working. And this concept of using the English word reform and the English words opening up, um, it is a misrepresentation or a lie. And so one of the things that is going on now is that the U.S. China Business Council is leading this delegation of um, American multinationals that have one foot basically trapped in China, to try to understand what's coming out of this third plenum, and maybe to try to persuade the leadership that you really need to do a reform as we understand it. But here's where I come out on this, Matt. I think that that the party used the English language very cleverly, because when they throw out the words reform and opening up, that is, they're playing to Wall Street and saying, we're changing now. This is this third plenum. Everything is going to be fine. We're going to get back on the straight and narrow, and let's bring that foreign direct investment coming back in. And that's what we're going to see in the propaganda in the months and years to come.
Well, I mean, that is essentially the foreign direct investment is what has propped up China's economy for the last couple decades. And, hard to say what China would look like had that not happened, but it certainly wouldn't be the world's #2 economy without this trillions and trillions of foreign direct investment.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And,
So,
it's really interesting, Matt. If you could take the investment into China coming out of the old free Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and the United States, I'm not so sure China would have progressed a whole lot from where they were at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution.
Well, speaking of, I think this is a good time to talk about Enbridge. We're talking about Xi Jinping having more state control over the economy. China is working on something called Enbridge, which stands for Multi-Central Bank Digital Currency Bridge. So what is this? Is this the ticket to save China's economy?
I don't think so. I think that what this is well, let's go back. If we go back to the pre-COVID era, let's say the beginning of the where the Belt and Road was running at its peak, one of the things that was, we saw was the rise of Bitcoin. And initially, the party leadership was against digital currencies. And the reason was, it had a libertarian bent, the government had no control. And so the development then changed to an e-yuan. And the reason for that was that the Chinese leadership said, now, wait a second. If we have this digital currency, and we run it through our central bank, we can enhance the control over our citizens. Meaning, if you don't do what the party says, we cut off your income, your ability to move money, your ability to eat, and so forth. We have ultimate control. So there was this mind shift. So now we come to this Enbridge facility that China is pushing along with the central banks from Hong Kong, Thailand. Who else is in there? Hong Kong, Thailand,
The UAE, I believe.
UAE, correct. And the idea there is to create a cross-border digital currency payment system. And the most recent development that adds a little bit of fire to this is that Saudi Arabia has joined in with this. Now, to put this in perspective, this is a project that is being essentially under the development or supervision of the Bank of International Settlements based in Switzerland. And they're looking at ways that they can speed up the transfer of funds across border. Now, what we have to look at is on the China side. And one of the pieces that is important here is that China, if you all recall, is a party to the regional RCEP, Regional Cooperation Economic Program or something. This is essentially a free trade agreement between a number of Southeast Asian countries. And there is a provision in that trade agreement for potential digital resolution of payments across border. So the picture is that maybe China would use this as a way of getting around its currency challenges on the open market, with the fact that its internal currency, the renminbi within the country, is not convertible. They would use this digital currency. The reason that I said that I don't think this is going to be the big be all and end all is it's going to take some time for other central banks to get on board with this, and it's not going to happen quickly. Put it in perspective, there are some 11,000 banks on the SWIFT system. I think I have the number right, 11,000. And there are 1,500 banks potentially looking at this Enbridge system. So China is behind it. And I think the fact that China is behind it actually is a deterrent to other countries jumping into this system. But the Enbridge, part of the impetus for this Enbridge system, Matt, is coming back to a question that you raised earlier, is actually to help sanctions proof the Chinese economy. If they can get around the SWIFT sanctions imposed on Russia using digital currency transfers, then they've essentially built another wall around their economy.
So using Enbridge, I just, for our viewers who might not understand what this really means, when banks use the SWIFT system, it's these international transactions are basically settled in US dollars, right? And so that gives the United States a measure of control, because they can say, well, if you break the rules, Russia, by invading Ukraine, we're going to kick you out of that system, which means because we control the dollar. And that basically means they can't really do transactions with any of the banks that are in any of the countries that are on that system.
Perfect.
But Enbridge, right? So Enbridge is different in that it's set up by China, it's controlled by China, and it doesn't settle anything in US dollars. It settles it in China's own digital currency.
Correct.
Right. And so China's digital currency is not, I mean, you brought up Bitcoin, which is like almost hilariously opposite, right? Because everything that people like most about Bitcoin is that it's decentralized. You can't control it because these Bitcoin miners are scattered everywhere and there's no way to control them all or conquer more than half of that mining operations. But China's kind of using that same idea, but 180 degrees, right? It's like a digital currency, but we, the CCP, control every aspect of it. So they control the value of it. They control basically how much and to whom it's available, right? If a Chinese citizen is using digital currency and they've become a persona non grata, then the Communist Party can just turn their account to zero, right? So I understand then why a lot of Western institutions are like, if I put my assets in this digital currency, maybe that is a very, very substantial risk. But then it's like, well, why on earth are Thailand and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia even interested in this? Because it seems like to them it could be just a way to set up for failure.
Well, okay, boy, you've nailed it on the head there, Matt. Look, the newest entrant into the M-Bridge is Saudi Arabia, and this is a way that the Saudis can transact their oil transactions with China through this process. So we understand that. Thailand is and under Anwar Ibrahim, both Thailand and Malaysia are heavily penetrated and leaning towards China. They are also parties to this regional cooperation economic program that I mentioned previously, this free trade agreement. And these countries, Thailand and Malaysia, and Hong Kong is also in there, but we now know that's China essentially. Thailand and Malaysia have heavy Chinese uh, ownership of their banking institutions, and they are heavily leaning in the Chinese direction in terms of their financing, their Belt and Road activities, so forth and so on. So it's not surprising that those two countries are there. When it comes to the UAE, the UAE is um, is sort of an anomaly within the Middle East in that they are attempting to be the one-stop shop for exporting around the world. So the UAE has free trade agreements with some tremendous number of countries. I don't know whether it's 80, 90, 100, something like that. And the idea is that if you're an exporter, you have an incentive to set up a business in the UAE, and then you take advantage of their trading agreements around the world. And so the UAE is looking for national advantage in this digital payment system because, in theory, this is yet another financial tool that they can offer to companies around the world. If you set up operations in the UAE, then you can transact cross-border deals with China or other participating countries under the M-Bridge system. So the incentives for these various the countries are just slightly different. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like the UAE sees itself as a uh, you know, mostly legitimate business. You can come into our store and you can buy goods and whatever, but we also have this side business. And if you're kind of on the criminal side of things, you can come in and you can, pay a little extra and get your unlicensed, pharmaceuticals or guns or whatever in our sort of side market. And that seems maybe what they're thinking of in terms of Enbridge. Is that a good analogy?
Well, no, I mean, that may be a piece of it, Matt, but I think that you might have. I think there's a strong legitimate piece to from the UAE's perspective. That is that they're trying to develop themselves as a trading center globally, and so they're attempting to pull in businesses from other countries to do trading around the world. And so if they get they're an early adapter of this Enbridge system so that they can perhaps in the future provide digital cross-border transactions for companies that have been set up in the UAE. I think that it's there's a legitimate in the attitude of the UAE trade types. There's a legitimate piece that they're looking for there. I just think that coming back to the big picture here, that this whole notion of a cross-border digital currency system that China is pushing is simply not attractive to uh, many and even most countries around the world. China has lost the luster of its financial uh, security and status, and I just don't see that being widely adopted.
What about I think BRICS is doing something similar with they're calling it BRICS Bridge, but it's essentially also an experiment in doing cross-border payments through digital currency, but with BRICS countries. Is that more likely to take off because there are just more countries in BRICS?
I think the BRICS one, Shelley, it is more likely to take off. But again, we have to remember that China has its hand in the whole BRICS arrangement, and that's a substantial negative, as far as I'm concerned. So I think that the BRICS initiative will be far more successful than Enbridge, but it's going to be a long, hard haul for them to put it together.
I have a question about the digital yuan, and I don't know if you can answer this, but there are questions every once in a while about China becoming a reserve currency, like the yuan becoming a reserve currency. And I think we've talked before about why that's unlikely to happen because of their monetary policy and how they use US dollars to basically stabilize their own domestic economy. Um, is the digital yuan subject to the same constraints as the physical yuan that is being traded? Do you know what I mean? Like, could they use the digital yuan in a way that would give them more economic leverage globally without possibly sacrificing the stability of their domestic economy?
Yes. And the reason I say that is that um, the party leadership is never going to allow the internal yuan within the country the to to be traded on an open market, because then it has to float and they lose control once they float that currency. And that's an advantage they will retain all the way up until the Ceausescu moment that we talked about earlier. But on the digital side, this is where they hope to take the dollar down. And the issue, Shelley, I think is really comes to how well will this be accepted over time? And and my own view is that we in this country have a long track record, uh, basically since World War II, of the dollar being the um, international currency of exchange, and for the digital yuan to take over the dollar's position, that's a long, hard, heavy uh, haul to make. And China's soft power, China's position in the global arena as a responsible superpower uh, does not add to the desirability of converting to a digital yuan. So I think this is going to be a tough one to sell internationally throughout the world.
But they could try it without putting their own economy at risk, the same, unlike what they would have to do with the domestic yuan.
Correct. And that try is one of I think, one of the important pieces between their push on this whole question of Enbridge.
Well, so this is interesting. Earlier, you said that America first should not be America alone. That the U.S. need to work with all of its allies, all of the countries that have similar stakes vis-a-vis China. Um, we see China attempting to create its own sphere of influence, to not be China alone, BRICS, Enbridge. But it seems their reputation internationally has become so tarnished that they cannot get this alliance of other countries to challenge the West together. Is China doomed to go it alone?
No, China has got some. China has got some friends, I guess. Uh, they've got Russia. They've got North Korea. They've got Iran. There may be some others that fall in over time. It's not a very desirable community from a trade economic standpoint. Um, they had recently Argentina fall out of the boat, and we don't know what else is likely to happen. They've acquired the Solomon Islands as a friend of theirs now, I guess. But you're right, Chris. Eh, they don't have this term called stickiness, meaning people are really drawn to China and want to stay a part of their sphere of influence. So your question is really leads to what's going to happen in terms of trade as we look into the future. And what I think we're going to see is that the concept of a global trading system, you can see this now, is actually fracturing into trading blocks. And so we will have the United States, its like-minded countries, its friends, its allies in one trading block, and China with its Iran, Russia, North Korea, and a few others in its trading block, and other countries will try to play off against each other, but eventually we'll see how these trading blocks develop over time. There may be an independent one set up in Europe. I don't know.
So what I'm hearing is, as we head into economic uncertain times, we should all be investing in NFTs.
Oh.
All right. Well, David, thanks so much for joining us again. We had you on about 2 weeks ago, and a lot happened in that time, so I'm glad we could get you back on.
All right. Great to be with all of you again. Aloha.
It's good to have you back, Shelley.
Thanks. I wish I could say I missed it, but I was actually too busy to notice.
In your secret infiltration of the Chinese naval base, which is what we said you were doing?
I can neither confirm nor deny.
It happened. Thank you for watching this episode of China Unscripted. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
We'll talk to you next time.